Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's Eric Stewart speaking from the Emergency Planning College here up in Easingwold, and just about to start this afternoon's session on the webinar, Safety Advisory Groups, Is It Time to Legislate? If there is anybody who's just joined us, if you have a look at the top of your screen, there's a green box there which when you select it will give you an option between questions and answers or chat, and you can use either of those options at the end of the session to ask questions, and I'll try and reiterate the question and then give you an answer. If there's anything urgent or pressing during the course of the webinar, then by all means use it there if you want me to clarify anything that I've said. So, looking at the list, unfortunately all I get is your names. I've got no idea of your experience or how many there are of you in terms of what experience you've got in the industry. So I'm going to set this at a fairly middle level and try and explain where we are at the moment and why we're there, and then move on to where we think we're going in the future. So if we go back, most of this comes from certainly the 1980s, the so-called decade of disaster, when just about everything that you can imagine going wrong went wrong. And you'll see at the bottom of the screen there, I've actually included one that's outside the 80s, 1971, the Ibrox disaster, and the significance of that. For those that don't know, it will become apparent very shortly. There is one, though, that frequently gets forgotten in the middle of that, and perhaps because it was such a small event, relatively speaking, in the middle of all those others with so many dead, and that was the Donington Monsters of Rock concert, where two people died in a crowd crush in very wet and muddy conditions at the front of stage. And if you pick all of those out and just take the ones that are specifically event-related, with the exception of Heysel, which I've taken out because it's overseas, there are only 4 during that period that were event-related in the UK, and just the one that was actually related directly to an event rather than a football match. So where did that take us to? Well, one of the things we have to help us now in terms of football and other sporting events is the Green Guide. It emanates from the 1971 Ibrox disaster and the Wheatley report after 55 people died at the same location as people had previously been killed and injured. Popwell in 1985, after the Bradford fire, fed his recommendations into the 3rd edition, and then after Hillsborough, Lord Justice Taylor made further recommendations for the Green Guide and asked that more notice be given by those involved in the safety aspects of football matches to the Green Guide and the new recommendations. In terms of the Purple Guide, though, that's something slightly different. It was originally the Pop Code, first published in 1993, with a 2nd edition in 1999, and then a huge gap to the current situation we have, where at last, after over a decade, it's been reviewed and rewritten, and was published at the beginning of the summer in terms of the events industry looking and being able to review the recommendations and that report in the hope that we can go live with it in around about March of next year. And the consultation period on that finishes at the end of this month. I was asked on the earlier session if we have a direct website for that. We will add it to the notes of this session when it's uploaded onto the Emergency Planning College website early next week, probably Monday or Tuesday. But in the meantime, if you just Google or use any of the other search engines, then you'll find that the Purple Guide 2013 gives you a direct access into a page that looks something like the one that you're seeing on screen at the moment. We do also, of course, have the Licensing Act 2003, which gives us the full licensing criteria: prevention of crime and disorder, public safety, prevention of public nuisance, and protection of children from harm. In Scotland, they do have one additional piece of guidance in the Licensing Act in terms of protecting and improving public health. That's not in existence currently in England. And so, to the difference between the two. Why is the Green Guide so heavily followed and the Purple Guide not? Well, there are obvious and significant differences. In terms of the Green Guide, Hillsborough is still very much live. The events of that day live out frequently in the news media, and even over the last couple of days have been reiterated again in accounts of policing terms. For most of us, Bradford, Heysel and Ibrox are all well within living history and infamous events rather than famous. The phrase, "do you want another Hillsborough," is something that personally I heard frequently at football matches whenever we tried to stop access to people who shouldn't be getting into grounds and is still heard frequently at weekends, "Do you want another Hillsborough?" chanted by fans who are desperate to get in to see their club. And to a certain extent, football fans are still seen as a threat and needing some form of control. And sadly, the police were and still continue to be blamed for Hillsborough, and it's fair to say that no one within policing either would want or can afford another such event as that. In terms of the Purple Guide, it's probably harsh to say, but in reality, only 2 died, inverted commas. Compared to the events in relation to football, obviously fairly low numbers. More importantly though, as a result of that, no one was blamed. Police and other agencies were involved in the safety advisory group, but they weren't involved on site on the day at the time with what went wrong, and no one was to blame. It was one of those very unfortunate incidents. There has not yet been a mass fatality in recent years in terms of the events industry in the UK. Obviously we've seen them all over the world, including Europe, but not in recent history in terms of the UK. If we go back to the football analogy, both Popwell, Taylor and Wheatley, they were only 3 of the 9 official inquiries that have taken place in relation to football disorder and injuries and deaths of football fans. They led to the safety certification of the venues, something that we still don't have really in terms of venues for pop or festivals, concerts and such like. It led to the oversight by advisory groups, which were repeatedly recommended by the reports that came through. And of course the Green Guide has been frequently updated. Unlike the Purple Guide, as we saw earlier, the Green Guide is now in its 5th edition. And it has the oversight of the Sports Ground Safety Authority, previously the Football Licensing Authority. In event terms, we just don't have any of the above. The Purple Guide has no enforcement body. It doesn't have the equivalent of an FLA or an SGSA. The existing Purple Guide, and I'm talking now about the old guide, if you like, prior to the new one that's currently being reviewed, it made only 1 reference to safety advisory groups. But we are making progress. The new Purple Guide has over 1.5 pages of references to safety advisory groups. It talks of safety advisory groups as a non-statutory group of multi-agencies representatives formed to promote safety at public events. It tells you what the role of the SAG is, or it indicates what the role of the SAG is, and it gives some guidance in terms of who should be on the group and what its aims and objectives are. It says that they should be coordinated, usually, but not exclusively, by local authorities, and certainly we'll see later that's not always the case. It's more commonly the case, but not always. It reiterates the lack of legal powers that SAGs actually have in terms of empowerment, in terms of enforcement at events. It does, most importantly at 255, state quite clearly that it remains the event organiser's responsibility to ensure that appropriate action is taken as a result of advice from the safety advisory group. I think it's fair to say that we're probably heading in the right direction, and the only question that remains is the speed in which we get there. In January of this year, I concluded a survey of the events industry. It was initially intended purely as an academic piece of research for a BA dissertation that I was doing. However, it soon became apparent that it needed to be a little bit more than that. And the reason I say that is because originally I sent it to 42 industry professionals. Now, most of you will know, well, if you send a survey out, if you get 25 or 30% of the people responding, then that's a pretty good response. In this case, the 42 that went out were spread to other people, and I got a response of 106 in total. Those that responded were from local authorities, police, fire, ambulance, the security industry and event managers itself, and that was really important to try and get, for that survey, a broad span of people who were involved in the events industry. It was a good mix of respondents, almost split 3 ways between the private sector, local authorities and the emergency services. And again, the emergency services response that accounted for 30% were split themselves into 3. They broke down almost equally, as it says there, between fire, ambulance and police. What we're going to do now is just briefly look at the result of the surveys themselves. And you can see there, that's the actual breakdown, and these will be available as part of the presentation when it's published next week. This was the breakdown of those that actually responded. So it gives you a reasonable idea that it was a good spread across the industry. One of the questions that it asked was whether or not the events that people were involved with were subject to safety advisory groups. 45% of those said yes, 38% saying no, and with that 17% in the middle saying it's not that simple, and the answer basically was some are and some aren't, we ended up with a situation where it was around about 50-50 between those that do have safety advisory groups looking at them and those that don't. One thing I should say at this point was that it was emphasised quite heavily that the survey was specifically excluding sporting events. What I didn't want was the survey to be impacted by all those safety advisory groups that are already in existence for football and now other events. This was specifically aimed at the events industry. And we got a range of responses from people involved in large music festivals down to local events and council events on public highways. The next question asked was whether or not the SAG process was thought to be beneficial to public safety. Overwhelmingly, the response was yes, either mostly or always. In excess of 90% of those who took part of the survey thought SAG processes were beneficial, and a very small percentage thought hardly ever. No one that responded thought they were never beneficial. The respondents were also asked in the last 5 years whether they'd been involved in an event that was unsafe. Now, with hindsight, I actually wish I'd asked that question in two separate ones, in the last 5 years and perhaps in the last 12 months. But it was the last 5 years, and 40% agreed that they had been involved in an event that was unsafe in the last 5 years. Another 30% said some were safe and some weren't. So 70% of those people responding had been involved in what they deemed unsafe events in the previous 5 years. The next question was whether or not they agreed that an experienced SAG could have made a difference to the event. 45% said that they did think it would make a difference, and a further 26% said maybe it would have made a difference. A very small percentage, you can see, 12% did not think that the involvement of a SAG would have made any difference to the safety of the event. But the question was loaded. If you actually read the question, if you were part of the survey, it said, do you consider a qualified, experienced SAG might have prevented the problem? That was done deliberately because we wanted to see whether or not people would respond. So the next stage in the question was to ask if whether or not the SAGs that people were involved in, either as an organiser or sitting on the SAG, were sufficiently experienced. What that discovered was that with this fairly small survey of 100 or so, 38% thought the SAG was always experienced and skilled. A slightly higher number thought it was not always available, and sometimes around about 19 or 20%. So a real mixed range of people as to whether or not the SAG had the sufficient experience and skill and training to actually undertake its duties properly. That led us on to the next question, the all-important one as far as I was concerned in terms of building this event. Do you think legislation should be introduced to force local authorities to include SAGs as part of event planning processes? What was interesting was that 60%, over 60%, thought that some legislation was needed because there was insufficient presently to enforce the SAG process. Another 16% agreed but wanted to explain in a little bit more detail why that was the case. 16% thought there was sufficient legislation, and a smaller minority thought it wouldn't make any difference or would cause greater delays in the planning process. And I think that's a fair argument. The prospect of delaying the planning process still further is not one that most of us wish to consider. So in summary in that survey, it appeared that the industry was actually asking for guidance and or legislation, and it wasn't particularly clear which it was, but one or the other. It seemed that most private sector responders simply wanted some consistency. One of the biggest complaints that came back from the events industry itself was that as they moved from county to county or town to town to city, all the paperwork changed, all the requirements changed, and they weren't quite sure what questions they were going to be asked if they ever got to sitting in front of the Safety Advisory Group, if it existed. Those who thought that some guidance was necessary said that the main areas that they wanted covered was which events, the membership of the SAG, the experience or training, and consistency of paperwork. Asked specifically about the types of events that they thought ought to be covered by this guidance and thought ought to be covered by SAGs, the highest were unusual events or events in unusual places, with events on public highways and bonfire displays being fairly high, as well as events on greenfield sites. Quite a big mix and quite a big range of people that came back and answered this, and as you can see from the bottom, those that applied numbers to them varied considerably, and we'll go on and have a look at that in just a minute or so. What that survey led to was quite obvious need within the industry for some sort of guidance, and with the approval of the Emergency Planning College, that led on to a new survey which started just a month or so ago and has gone out specifically aimed at the local authorities, and we've aimed it at them because we anticipate if legislation or guidance was implemented, then the heaviest burden would probably fall on the local authorities. It has to be taken into context. This is a time where there are cutbacks and an awful lot of people wearing more than 2, 3 and sometimes even 4 hats now. This will cause additional work for some areas. But it was intended to try and see a national picture of what was going on and what was needed. The questionnaire or survey was sent out to 220 email contacts, not named individuals. They were just group emails from individual websites from local authorities. We didn't actually set a timetable for responses, but I asked, if people asked me when we wanted them back, then I asked for them by the end of October. The reason being, I could spend November and December getting them all together if there were a full response, and that we'd be in a position to publish that from around about January onwards. To date, it's actually been responded to by 68 or 69 local authorities. They're still coming in at 3 or 4 a day at the moment, and we're just about to send a reminder out to those who haven't actually been responded to the survey so far. And ultimately the idea would be to try to anonymise the responses and then publish them for everybody's purpose via the EPC website in the new year. Now, accepting that only around about a quarter or a third of the local authorities have responded so far, we have about 4% of those that have responded that don't have any SAG process whatsoever. 20% of those that do have SAGs have a type of consensual arrangement for applying the process. So in other words, they get the information, receive the information, share it amongst those members of the SAGs, and in most cases, if just one member of the SAG group agrees, then it will go before the main SAG, or at least some form of discussion will take place. Some of them have made it slightly more formal and started to apply a matrix or scoring system so that the nature of the event, the number of people attending, whether there's alcohol involved, whether it's taking place on a public highway, and a whole list of other criteria, give it a set of scores. And once it passes a trigger point, then it will automatically go to a safety advisory group or a small version of the safety advisory group, depending on what level we're at. From the survey so far, 10% are chaired by someone other than the local authority, which is unsurprising because there's no actual guidance out there for non-sport related SAGs, although the Green Guide says through the reports that they should be chaired by local authorities. We have about 10% that aren't, and the majority of those are chaired either by police officers or the fire brigade. In one instance though, the local authority expects the event organiser to supply the chair and to arrange the SAG meetings. One of the other triggers for the SAG meeting to take place was based purely on numbers. The number of spectators, which can vary for them from 500 to 5,000. So some local authorities, any event above 500 people would automatically trigger a safety advisory group. For others it was 5,000. But There's a whole list there that you can see, hopefully, of the other triggers: the use of local authority land, events that seem to be hazardous, new events, new organisers, new venues, unknown organisers, particularly if the local authority had no history of that organiser, would be likely to put it through a SAG process. Interestingly, or at least I find it interesting, the council events, some local authorities only SAG their own council events, whereas other local authorities only SAG non-council events. So those two seem to be at loggerheads with each other there. In the survey, 96% of those that have responded so far have asked for some SAG guidance. And they thought the guidance should include who the members of the SAG should be, what their experience, qualifications and training should be, some form of consistency for the paperwork, a summary of SAG powers, or at least a list of the powers that were available to SAG members wearing another hat. So if the police had powers of enforcement, or the fire brigade had powers of enforcement, not directly as part of the SAG, but additional, a list of those. They've asked for roles and responsibilities outlined for the SAG and for its statutory members, and some form of charter, constitution or terms of reference, lots of different phrases being used, but I think generally all asking for the same thing: an outline document that says what is this group all about. And the other thing they've asked for in a number of cases is for how frequently those meetings should be held. Personally, I think that's a matter of local discussion. It will much depend on how many events and the scale of those events, and that's something that we would probably seek not to advise on and let that decision be made locally. So where are we in terms of government interest or government ownership in this? Well, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport has quite openly said it has no responsibility for the Purple Guide or for safety advisory groups. Both of these, they say, and this is a result of letters quite recently written to me, state that they're owned by the HSE. The HSE is a non-departmental public body but sits in terms of administration underneath the Department of Work and Pensions. With the help of my local MP, we've managed to write to the head of the Department of Work and Pensions to ask what they're doing in terms of the Purple Guide and safety advisory groups, and that was the official response, which is just about to pop up on your screen. Mark Hoban, who's the Minister of Employment, for who this comes under, states that the HSE does not consider the introduction of further statutory provision or guidance to be necessary. Having said that, that was on the 25th of September, and on the 7th of October, under the Cabinet reshuffle, Mark Hoban was replaced by Esther McVeigh. We may receive a different response when we start writing again to Esther McVeigh, but I suspect that the answer will be the same. There is little, if any, appetite at government level to legislate in any way either the Purple Guide and its recommendations or safety advisory groups. So in conclusion, we do seem to be heading in the right direction. So it may well be that despite the somewhat provocative title of this webinar, which was designed intentionally to hook you and draw you in, we hope and we think that legislation may not be necessary. Most people believe, and we believe, that some form of guidance would be helpful, and even better would be some guidance with government support. The industry is asking for it, local authorities are asking for it, and why then is it so difficult to actually get this off the ground? There is a fear, it seems, within government that by writing or helping to write the guidance document, that passes the responsibility back to that government department if anything went wrong. The Purple Guide and most SAGs quite clearly state that the event remains the responsibility of the event organisers, and the Safety Advisory Group is there to assist, support and advise on safety matters. It should never take over the role of planning the event, never take over that part of the responsibility. One might ask the question somewhat provocatively, if they have the knowledge and experience but don't assist in writing the guidance, then does that lack of guidance make them responsible if something goes wrong, or partly responsible? If you have the knowledge and the experience and don't share it, could you be held partly liable for not sharing it afterwards? Our intentions at the Emergency Planning College at the moment, up to about a week or so ago, were to write some guidance in relation to safety advisory groups. To pass that guidance out as widely as we could to those that were interested, and there's at least 50 departments and groups that are on that list for consultation. After that consultation, to revisit the guidance, and then to continue, once it's written, to seek government support to it. If we can get DCMS, Department of Work and Pensions, or the HSE, to put their name alongside ours on the front cover, then it would actually give it some weight and some support. We're seeking industry support through its umbrella organisations, such as the Events Industry Forum, and through the local authority support with the assistance of LAOG, the Local Authority Events Advisory Organisers Group. Our intention was to include that SAG advice within future revisions of the Purple Guide. And I say it was because in the last 48 hours things have changed and have moved on very, very quickly. The Events Industry Forum has engaged with Beverly Griffith, the Director of the Faculty of Public Safety at the Emergency Planning College, and actually asked for that to take place. LAOG, and I'm grateful for Andy who's tuned in, who's part of LAOG, are supportive of this work and will be working together on it. And the EIF, the Events Industry Forum, have actually requested a chapter now to be written specifically for the Purple Guide on safety advisory groups. It seems, ladies and gentlemen, that the legislation won't be necessary because in terms of guidance, all systems are go. I've put on the screen my email address. Please note it's Eric S. Stewart at AOL.com. There is an extra S in the middle and it's S-T-U-A-R-T. Eric S. Stewart at AOL.com. I would appreciate if you have any suggestions after this that you wish to add or help or offers of help, then please come back to me and let me know. In the meantime, I'm going to open it up the floor for questions. We've got 4 on there already, so if you bear with me. Steve, do I see a SAG being a useful tool to be coordinated by county-wide SAG or more local district SAG? There are difficulties with both, whichever way you do it. If you use local SAGs, then you have no coordination across the county necessarily. If you have a county SAG, you may lose the local knowledge that's helpful in actually running SAGs for specific events. And perhaps it's a combination of the two. We've had a number of responses from areas where they have a county-wide SAG, but also local event-related SAGs. So the event-related or the event-specific SAG will, at a local level, actually do the SAG process, but then report in to a county-wide level just to let them know what's going. We will look at all the different options and we will offer them within the guidance as options, as a package. The purpose of the guidance is definitely not to be prescriptive. We do not want to go down the legislative path. This should be very much like the Purple Guide. It's there for you to look at, to consider, compare what other people are doing, and make decisions around how you want to set your own SAG up. Steve's got another one question. Where do you see the responsibility for coordinating SAG, environmental health, licensing, or community safety-based, or safety advisors role? Who would be responsible for council events, council employees, and council sites? Okay. I think 2 or 3 questions in one there. Again, across the UK, and we'll publish it as part of the survey, we'll give you an indication of where all the local authorities have this area of responsibility. Environmental health is a very popular one. Those that have specific events teams is obviously a very popular one. But in terms of local authority events, that of course puts them in a bit of a dilemma because they are planning an event which they then have the safety advisory group on, so they're scrutinising their own safety, and I don't know if people agree, but that may be a problematic. If you write a paper, you need somebody else to look at it, to review it, otherwise you just miss the mistakes that you wrote into it in the first place. So it may be better for council events to have someone external to the event planning team actually scrutinising it through the SAG process. But again, it will be a local decision based on the guidance, and we'll give you all the options that are available. Jonathan, the Purple and Green guides are both available online. You can simply do a Google search. if you saw the slide of the purple guide, the one with the various blocks, which are the chapter headings, that is the new version of the purple guide. And it's probably best to have a look at both, but both green and the two purple guides are both available online simply as a search, but we will put the links onto the website when we upload this webinar next week. Thanks, Jonathan. You've just found the purple guide online. Fantastic. Jackie, you haven't actually said what local authority you are. Sorry, Jackie's question is, I chair the Local Safety Advisory Group. I'm not aware of any survey. What dialogue has been undertaken in Scotland? The survey was sent out to every local authority in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I'm very conscious of the fact that because they were sent to generic council email addresses, some haven't reached their destinations. If you can drop me an email using that email below, then eric.stewart@aol.com, I will send it directly out to you. I will also tell you where it's reached in terms of your local authority and which email address I sent it to, if that helps. Okay, Jonathan's found the purple guide, that's good. Steve, thank you. Hopefully that did answer your question, and it appears to have done. At the moment, I have no more questions outstanding. I'm going to keep the line open just for another minute or so, just in case anybody else wants to come back. Okay, I'm guessing that's nothing else, or somebody is typing a very long question. If you're actually typing a very long question, can you press the send button now? I don't want to cut you off while you're halfway through it, but at least so that we know that you're writing one. No, there's nothing else coming through, ladies and gentlemen, in which case, if I can thank you for your time and your attention this afternoon. Just a final reminder, if you have any comments that you wish to add... Oh, I'm going to hang it just there. Jonathan has a question. Can you just bear with us 1 second? Just give Jonathan the time to type it out. Okay, we seem to have actually, Jonathan did say that he had a question, but now seems to have dropped off the system. Hopefully, he will send that question directly to me on email. And what I will do is any emails that I get directly that are related. Okay, it's just come through. Jonathan's question is, what is a reasonable time frame for an event organiser to interact with a SAG? Yeah, really good question, and it depends on the size and scale and impact that the event is going to have. If you have a huge event, something like New Year's Eve in London or Notting Hill Carnival, then those processes take up to 18 months. Down in London, we're normally planning this year's event and the one beyond. But small-scale events, the question quite simply is, how much time do I need to implement any recommendations that are made by the Safety Advisory Group? And that will depend on the size and complexity of the event. We will try and put some recommendations into the guidance, some best practice from places around the country. Fortunately, by sending out this survey, we've had an awful lot of feedback with guidance documents, some of which are available online from local authorities. If people want to access some of that information, then that's fine. And Jonathan, I've got your direct email through address as well, and I'll pop an email off to you afterwards. Yeah, I got your email. Thanks, Jonathan. I will drop you an email later on today and see what we can cover with a telephone conversation. And I don't seem to have any other questions coming in whatsoever. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and your patience on this, and no doubt speak to you sometime in the future. Thanks very much.